We turn now to Jeremy Scahill, the national security correspondent for The Nation magazine and longtime Democracy Now! Correspondent. For the past several years, Jeremy's been working on a book and film project called Dirty Wars: The World is a Battlefield. The book came out on Tuesday. The film, which is directed by Rick Rowley, will be released in theaters in June. The book follows Jeremy to Afghanistan, Somalia, Yemen, and beyond as he chases down the hidden truth behind America's expanding covert wars operated by the CIA and JSOC, the Joint Special Operations Command. We turn now to part 2 of Amy Goodman's interview with Jeremy. She began by asking him about the title of his book.
I called it Dirty Wars because, you know, particularly in this administration, in the Obama administration, I think a lot of people are being led to believe that there is a such thing as a clean war, and that the drone strikes and what's called targeted killing. I mean, I use that term myself, but it's actually not if you think about it, it's actually not a very appropriate term for what's going on, because it's, as we know, these strikes are anything but targeted in many cases, and we don't even know the identities of many of the people that we're killing in intentional strikes. So I called it Dirty Wars because there is no such thing as a clean war, and drone warfare is not clean, but also as a sort of allusion to how we've returned to the kind of 1980s way of waging war, where the U.S. was involved in all these dirty wars in Central and Latin America, in Guatemala, Nicaragua, Honduras, and beyond. And we're using, you know, we're in a world right now where the U.S. is using proxies that effectively are death squads in Somalia to hunt down people that the U.S. has determined are enemies. We're using mercenaries. President Obama continues to use mercenary forces in various wars, declared and undeclared, around the world. You also have the aiding of dictatorships and other right-wing governments around the world and propping them up. It's very similar to what Reagan and company were doing in Central America. And you have an increasingly paramilitarized CIA. You know, the CIA has served a major paramilitary function for many decades at the beginning, from the 1950s through the 1970s. And then because of the scandals of assassinations and the Church Committee hearings and the House Committee on Political Assassinations, you had a generation of CIA people that came up sort of feeling like, wow, covert action, we should be careful about getting into this business. After 9/11, the CIA has been on a constant sort of curve back to paramilitarization. So you have the CIA functioning as a paramilitary organization, and JSOC has become very, very powerful. And so to me, the concept of the world as a battlefield actually is not something I thought up. It's a doctrine, actually a military doctrine called Operational Preparation of the Battle Space, which views the world as a battlefield. And what it says is that if there are countries where the military predicts that conflicts are likely or that war is a possibility, you can forward deploy troops to those countries to prepare the battlefield. And under both Bush and Obama, the world has been declared the battlefield. You know, the authorization for the use of military force that was passed after 9/11 is technically the law that President Obama and his administration point to when they say they have a right to drone strike in Yemen, because these people are connected to the 9/11 attacks. But in reality, one of the enduring legacies of the Obama presidency is going to be that he solidified this Cheney-esque view of the U.S. government, which says that when it comes to foreign policy, that the executive branch is effectively a dictatorship, and that Congress only has a minimal role to play in oversight. I mean, Cheney didn't want Congress to have any role in it. Obama's administration plays this game with Congress. Certain people can go into the padded room and look at this one document, but not this other document. You're not allowed to bring in a utensil to write with, and you can't ever tell anyone what you said. That's congressional oversight on our assassination program. But they have doubled down on this all-powerful executive branch perspective. And that's why we see this stuff expanding.
What about this kill list and the elevation of John Brennan, who worked with President Obama in the Oval Office? And how much do you understand about what does take place around defining who will die and who will live?
Yeah, I mean, you know, we now know that there's these things that you know, are called Terror Tuesdays, where they look at rosters of potential targets and present them to the president. And the president, my understanding, is very, very involved with plucking names off and deciding who stays on. And you know, you have a working group that is that's essentially focused around the clock on figuring out who to kill next around the world. And what I think is really both disturbing and interesting is that there are multiple. I know that there are at least 3 separate sets of kill lists. There's the kill list that the CIA has, and then there's the Joint Special Operations Command, and then there's another National Security Council list that contains certain high-value individuals that the U.S. wants taken out. And so in a country like Yemen, you have both the CIA and JSOC conducting operations. In Pakistan, that's been true for a very long time. In Somalia, JSOC has conducted operations on the ground. The CIA has done drone strikes, and JSOC has also come in by helicopter and launched missiles at people.
Of course, JSOC is extolled because of the killing of Osama bin Laden. It was, what, SEAL Team 6. And where did they get SEAL Team 6,
right.
that name?
And Disney tried to trademark the name SEAL Team 6 after the killing of Osama bin Laden, and then they lost that battle. I mean, really, the story of JSOC is in many ways the story of Admiral William McRaven, who I think is one of the most powerful military figures certainly in modern U.S. history. But McRaven was an original member of SEAL Team 6, which now is known as the Naval Warfare Development Group, DEVGRU for short, DEVGRU. He was an original member of SEAL Team 6, and at the time there were, I think, only 2 SEAL teams, but they decided to call it SEAL Team 6 as a sort of to throw the Russians off, so that it was Cold War politics. They wanted the Soviet Union to believe that there were more teams of these elite SEALs than there were. And SEAL Team 6 is probably the most elite unit that's ever been trained and brought up in the U.S. military, and for much of its lifetime, since it was created in the early 1980s, SEAL Team 6 has operated discreetly in missions like the one that killed Osama bin Laden that never make it into the newspaper. Very active in Central and Latin America, in Africa, and elsewhere. And so McRaven was an original member of SEAL Team 6 and would have been one of the people forward deploying to Afghanistan very early on after 9/11, except that a few weeks before the September 11th attacks, McRaven had injured his back in a parachuting accident and couldn't deploy to Afghanistan. So instead, McRaven was tapped by General Wayne Downing, this is very early on after 9/11, to come in and advise the National Security Council, which is basically the President and the Secretary of Defense, and then there's staffers on the National Security Council, but to be at the center of developing the policy for how the U.S. would hunt down those responsible for 9/11. So McRaven, because of this back injury, is right there in the front row in the White House and helped to shape the policy that he would later implement as the commander of JSOC. So he's there in the NSC, very close. He sees how the political wheels spin inside the White House and has a sort of upfront education to how the White House works. Then goes back into the field, McRaven does, and is the guy that led the hunt and eventual capture of Saddam Hussein in Iraq. And he also, along with General Stanley McChrystal, he was McChrystal's deputy at JSOC at the time for much of the Iraq War. They ran a Murder Inc. operation in Iraq, where they were hunting down the deck of cards, but they were also they were using intelligence gained from one raid to lead them to the next raid. And they also were running a secret prison in Baghdad called Camp Nama, which stood for Nasty A Military Area. I'm not sure they can say that word on the air, but and it was effectively a secret prison where high-value detainees were brought. Saddam Hussein was held there originally when he was brought, and McRaven, the night Saddam was arrested, had a cigar with one of the intelligence chiefs of JSOC outside of Saddam's cell in what was an old Saddam torture chamber that JSOC then turned into its own torture chamber. And they would bring high-value detainees there, and I get into great description about this in my book from people that were working at the prison at the time and other interrogators that had been there, and that became the sort of model for that took hold and spread around. You had torture happening at Guantanamo. You had torture happening at Abu Ghraib. You had this sort of spread of these torture tactics. But a lot of it was because JSOC implemented torture techniques at Camp Nama in Iraq that were developed from something called the SEER training, which is survival. It's a survival program that all special operators go through, and it's effectively they are tortured themselves. They're waterboarded. The guys have had their ribs broken and other limbs broken. Sometimes you're abducted. The curriculum was developed based on studying the torture techniques of communist China, the North Vietnamese, going all the way back to the Civil War. They have all this institutional knowledge in the U.S. military of torture techniques of the enemy. And they train U.S. soldiers to prepare to endure those torture techniques.
Survival, evasion, resistance, escape.
Right, so that's the SEER, S-E-R-E program. So this is this training program where it's to prepare U.S. soldiers for it. What they did is they reverse engineered it. And they said, we're going to start using the tactics that we've taught you to endure against our enemy. So in effect, they became the enemy, the lawless enemy. And they would use these, that's where waterboarding came from. They would use these techniques on detainees. And that spread. And so the standard operating procedures, the SOPs that were used at Camp Nama, were also used then at Abu Ghraib and elsewhere. And there were dissidents within the interrogator community who would try to stand up to this, and then they would have their lives threatened, or they would be blackballed. And no one was allowed to access these prisons. And to this day, the U.S. military is operating what they call filtration sites, because they're not categorizing them as prisoners. They're categorizing them as people who have intelligence that could lead to saving of lives. So they hold them incommunicado and say, well, no, they're not prisoners. These are people that we're interrogating. And they do it sometimes for months. Under President Obama, people have been held on Navy brigs in ships in the Indian Ocean for months at a time, incommunicado, while they're being interrogated. So these stories, some of them have been out in the press, but we haven't even been started to come to terms with all that has taken place in sort of the world that's been created over these two administrations, Bush and Obama.
Jeremy Scahill, you did original reporting. You discovered a secret prison, U.S. prison in Somalia.
Well, it wasn't a U.S. prison. It was when I flew into Adenade Airport in Mogadishu in the summer of 2011. When we landed, Rick Rowley and we saw this large, I don't know how to describe it other than it looked like a forward operating base that you would see in Afghanistan, but it had this sort of pink paint on it. It was and Somalis call it the Pink House. And we discovered that it was a new counterterrorism center that the CIA and military intelligence were running in Somalia, and they were training and preparing a Somali task force to go down and hunt members of the radical group al-Shabaab, which pledged its allegiance to al-Qaeda. And they were paying the Somalis $200 in cash each month to work on this task force. And so as I started to investigate that, I met people who were working with the CIA that were Somalis, and they described for me a prison that's in the basement of Somalia's National Security Service, which is funded and backed by the United States. And in this basement, high-value prisoners are held in a bedbug-infested hellhole, and they are interrogated at times by CIA interrogators and French and other foreign interrogators. And I also met journalists that were put into that prison and saw the U.S. interrogators there. And they were put in that prison for filming things that the U.S.-backed Somali government didn't want filmed. And so when I did that reporting and I called, we're not allowed to say who we call, I called a U.S. official, I guess I have to say. And the first thing he said to me is, yeah, that sounds right. And, that we're doing that. And eventually they released a statement to me saying, it makes perfect sense that we would partner with them, and admitted that they were doing interrogations there, but said it was very limited and that they sit in on debriefings with Somali agents. But I wrote about the case of one man who was snatched in Nairobi, Kenya, from his home, taken to Wilson Airport in Nairobi, and then flown to Somalia, where he was then held in that prison. And he was a guy that was believed to be the right-hand man of one of the leaders of al-Qaeda in East Africa. But the U.S. told the Kenyans, go pick him up. This is under Obama. Go pick this guy up. They go pick him up. They render him to this prison, where then U.S. agents interrogate him. So how far have we come? Well, under Bush, they were running secret prisons in Poland and Thailand and elsewhere, these so-called black sites where they were torturing people. Under President Obama, you have the U.S. directing another government to snatch the person. So it's not U.S. agents that are doing it, but you say, we want you to go and take them and put them in this prison in a third country where they don't live. And then they're going to be put into this hellish prison, the conditions of which constitute, I think, torture, when you don't give anyone access to sunlight ever, and you have them in a bedbug-infested, filthy, circumstances. And then U.S. agents can go in and interrogate them. How huge of a difference are those two things? Because, we tend to think that, or I think the collective wisdom is that President Obama rolled back all of these Bush-era policies with his initial executive orders. In reality, there's been cosmetic changes to a lot of this. And
he said he wanted to close secret prisons.
In fact, there was an order to close the secret prisons, and I believe it was in April of 2009, Leon Panetta, the director of the CIA, said that we're out of the business of secret prisons. I don't know if that's true or not, but what I do know is true is that we're using other people's secret prisons, other countries' secret prisons, to do the same kind of dirty deeds that liberals were so rightly outraged about when President Bush was doing it around the world. So, I think that because it's a popular Democratic president, I think people have been convinced that things have really radically shifted, and in reality, they haven't. And I think a lot of the Bush people stand in awe of what President Obama has been able to do, because they know that they probably wouldn't have been able to get it done themselves. So, there are ways in which Obama pushed the Cheney agenda far beyond what a President McCain or a President Romney would have been able to do, because he had his base of supporters.
And to those who say you have to fight lawless terrorists without using the constraints of law.
Well, then we're a different nation. I mean, if that's true, then we have to step back. I mean, if the majority of Americans believe that, which I don't believe they do, then we're a different nation. Then we should go back and write a new constitution, and we should have a totally different concept of what it means to have a justice system, or have a judiciary that's supposed to give access to due process, where you're allowed to face your accusers. I mean, one of the things that was most fascinating to me in researching this book was to read about the Clinton era. I cut my teeth in journalism, as you know, Amy, because I started working for you in the 90s when Clinton was president. And I went back and I read some of the memos that have been declassified when the Clinton people were first looking at this question of assassination. And Richard Clarke, who was a counterterrorism advisor in many administrations, Democratic or Republican, said that it was almost like a Talmudic sort of system with how detailed they were in if this, then this, then this, in order to justify an assassination, that you had to have, know what kind of lock was on the door in the house that you wanted the SEALs to go in and raid to take the person down. And the Clinton people look like pacifists, basically, compared to what's happening under this administration, where on Tuesday you get together and decide who's going to live or die around the world. But this has evolved so radically from one Democratic President Clinton to the next in President Obama. I mean, President Obama looks like a ferocious hawk compared to Clinton or Jimmy Carter or any of these other presidents, which makes it so hilariously ironic, the sort of line that a lot of these right-wingers have about Obama, that he's like a Kenyan Mau Mau socialist or whatever. President Obama is a very hawkish, hard-hitting president when it comes to counterterrorism policies, when it comes to assassination, when it comes to the U.S. reserving the right to bomb countries that it's not at war with, and most importantly, when it comes to convincing the American people that these things are all lawful and right and are smarter than the Bush-era big wars.
Jeremy Scahill, author of the new book, Dirty Wars, The World is a Battlefield. We'll air more of Amy Goodman's interview with...
Thanks so much for watching this report from Democracy Now!, your daily independent global news hour. We don't accept advertising or corporate funding, but rather rely on donations from viewers like you. Please make your contribution by visiting democracynow.org. We need your support today to keep bringing you this hard-hitting, in-depth reporting.